Let's bring in NBC's Dasha Burns. She is live at Trump headquarters. What's the sense within the campaign going into tonight, and what's their plan?
Well, look, to your conversation about conceding, guys, I have to tell you, I have not heard a single rally that I've attended or watched where the former president has not done two things. Number one, claimed that the 2020 election was stolen and that he won. And number two, claimed that there is cheating going on in this election and that the only way that he can lose is if there is cheating. Both of those things, every rally that I've been to this election cycle. Of course, there is no evidence that 2020 was stolen. There's no evidence that there's any large-scale fraud going on this time around either. Today, though, this morning when he went to vote, our reporters Garrett Hake and Jake Traylor were there. They really pressed him on this issue of conceding, and he took a slightly different tone today than we've seen him take at some of these events. Take a listen.
There are people who are concerned that you didn't concede the election in 2020 when you lost. They're concerned that if you lost this election, you wouldn't concede again. What do you say to those people?
I think they're crazy. If I lose an election, if it's a fair election, I'd be the first one to acknowledge it. And I think so far, I think it's been fair.
So far, I think it's been fair, he said, but he has said just over the last 24 hours that he believes that there is cheating. So we've seen him sort of speak out of both sides of his mouth on this issue. In terms of the mood today, they are projecting confidence. He's also been saying at these final rallies that he thinks there's a 95% chance that he is going to win. Of course, we've all been seeing the polls. That is far from the reality. This race is extremely tight. Cautious optimism, projection of confidence. He's at Mar-a-Lago. He'll be watching the returns from there. Elon Musk, we just learned, is going to be joining him at Mar-a-Lago today. And then at some point, he'll make his way to the Palm Beach Convention Center, which is the official headquarters for his watch party tonight, guys.
Dasha Burns, thank you very much. All right, so you were just talking about a moment ago that we've seen this now for 9 years. We certainly reported on this in 2015, 2016, all that ugliness, all of the anger, all of the rage, all of the dark projections and what Donald Trump wanted to do as president. This idea that he was going to change when he went into the Oval Office was ridiculous. Obviously, Donald Trump is who he is. We can predict what he's going to be like if he is to win again. If he does not win again, how does this country find a way to knit itself back together? And who is responsible for trying to do that? Joe Biden wanted to do that while he was president. He intended to continue to try to do that if he was able to run again and to win. What is the answer here? Is it a policy thing? Is it going after immigration more conservatively? What is the difference maker? What changes the trajectory?
You mean if Harris wins?
If Harris wins.
Well, I think, first of all, she will have to literally reach out to the other side. Yeah. And I look at the Trump people in two ways. One are those people that no matter what he does, they're for him. He could do anything and they're for him. But there's also those Republicans who they just kind of dismiss his rhetoric. I have a number of friends who are Trumpers, and they just dismiss it. She will need to reach out, and I think she will have to have some policy positions that will reassure people early. She's talked about putting a Republican in the cabinet. I'll tell you another thing she should do, which I can tell you Biden did not do, and that is to cobble a group of people who can be advisors to her, that are not just made up of Cornell. There's got to be people, who are different than that, who are in the room, who are willing to tell her, talk truth to power. There's not enough talking truth to power.
If you put a Republican in a position of power in the cabinet, whatever it is, yes, that is important symbolically to a good number of Americans.
Right.
But to people who still believe that 2020 was stolen, to people who believe a whole list of lies about what's happening in government and the way things happen in elections. Does that make a difference? Do policy positions or appointing
I'd love to hear Cornell on this. Yeah.
Well, I think people like the governor they have an important role in this. And look, I think she is trying to build a a coalition unlike, look, I work for Obama to elections. I think she's trying to build a coalition that looks and is broader than his. And she's bringing around, look, I never thought I'm taking a selfie with the Cheney, right? And I think on Team Cheney, right? That's an odd thing. So I think she is trying to build it. But let's be real about this conversation. This is not going to be solved by policy position, right? And the guy that I worked for in 2008 was part of the sort of the breaking of the dam around this, right? And it is a changing America, and it is people who are afraid and anxious about the changes that they feel that's happening in America, and they feel they're losing. And they feel they're losing to people who don't traditionally look like them or live where they live. And we've got to have a deeper.
It is a policy question.
No, we've got to have a deeper conversation about that.
If she has a Republican Senate, which is more likely than not, and she's going, even to get confirmation, she's going to have a very different cabinet than she might prefer in terms of policy.
Why are we putting the onus on her differently than we put it on anyone else?
But if it's a Republican Senate, she's got to get people confirmed.
Well, Republicans have had Democratic Senates, and I've never heard us sit around and have a conversation about how the Republican has to reach out and put
Barack Obama had his Senate mostly confirmed on day one, on Inauguration Day, because they were Democrats.
Well, because but that's my point. This seems like a double standard to me, where she's got to do things dramatically different than any member has before.
But Cornel,
I just want us to acknowledge that we're asking her to do things dramatically different.
We are at a critical time in our country. I've been on Chris's show, and I've said, and I'll say it again here, we need to start looking at one another with respect. And that takes a little bit of a spiritual input here, where we know we're all a reflection of the big guy upstairs, and that we need to respect one another. Now, when we talk about policy, policy is a symbol. He said something, I think, really important, something we notice around the world. We have people who are out here who are good people. They're great Americans. Young men who feel they're disillusioned. They don't have any hope. We got problems with affordable housing. We have problems with the cost of health care. We have confusion around the cost of health care. We have an education system that is too old. Those are things that can send the signal that we're here to help you. As governor, one of the things I always thought about is it's just not good enough to grow the economy. But what about the people in the shadows? What do we do about them? And if she can begin to talk about that and get some Republicans to support that.
She has talked about that.
I know that. Then I think we can have a breakthrough. I'm not going to sit here and say this isn't difficult. But what a great opportunity for somebody to become one of the great leaders.
We're saying that,
absolutely.
We're not saying anything different, but I do think it takes Republicans to reach across. Reach across and work on this. That again, this is bigger than our policy difference. This is about America and its future. And how do we win the future? If we can't win the future if we're fighting each other.
I think Cornel's got a really valid point. The burden that we put on Democrats to find a way to move to comply with what Republicans desire, it can feel imbalanced at times. I think it's because Republicans have been much more intransigent in just the past recent administrations than Democrats have been unwilling to move. Cornel, really good to have you. John, you're not going anywhere. You're going to have to stick around for a little while.
Republicans have been more unified by the former president as leader of the party.
Yep.
Democrats have been fractious, but they managed to.
Republicans are pretty fractious, not being able to elect a speaker for.
I will still say a
many
lot
votes.
of voters I talk to believe in their own towns, in their own neighborhoods, that people want this done. They're exhausted. And they want to be able to talk to their neighbors, and and the Democrats want their kids to be able to trick or treat at a house that has a Trump sign, even if they really can't stand Donald
And there
Trump.
are a lot of people who don't like either party because either party is not responding to the critical needs that they have in their families.